In the 14th century, Venice was the richest city on earth. Its ships ruled the Mediterranean. Its gold currency, the ducat, became the international standard, and its financiers funded kings and empires. But behind its shimmering canals stood something even more powerful: the invention of modern banking. What Venice built would define how every financial system operates today. Deposits, credit, state-backed banks, even government debt. And yet, the very system that made Venice rich would also lead to its downfall. Before we dive deeper, take a second to subscribe. It helps keep stories like this alive. And I wonder, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Tell me in the comments. To understand Venice's role in creating the modern economy, we have to go back to the late Middle Ages. Around 1200, most of Europe still relied on the feudal system. Wealth came from land, not money. But Venice was different. It had no fertile soil, no empire of peasants. What it had instead was ships, merchants, and the sea. Trade became its lifeblood, and with trade came money and the need to manage it better. By the 13th century, Venetian merchants were conducting transactions across thousands of miles, dealing with multiple currencies under constant threat. Pirates, storms, wars, any of these could wipe out fortunes overnight. So they developed something revolutionary: the bill of exchange. It allowed merchants to settle debts and payments across great distances without moving physical gold. A merchant in Constantinople could pay another in Venice through trusted agents using paper promises instead of metal. Soon, these merchants realized something profound. They didn't need gold itself to do business. They only needed trust. This idea became the foundation of modern finance. Venice's next innovation was even more radical. In 1157, the city founded the Bank of San Marco, often considered one of the first state-backed banks in history. It began as a public fund where wealthy Venetians could deposit money. Over time, it became the central institution managing loans, payments, and government finance. The government began issuing debt known as prestiti to fund wars and public works, promising future repayment with interest. Citizens could buy and sell these debt certificates, creating one of the first government bond markets in history. For the first time, a state was borrowing directly from its people, and those people were earning interest on government promises. It was a genius system. It allowed Venice to raise money quickly for its fleet, maintain trade dominance, and avoid excessive taxation. The rich lent to the state protected trade routes, and everyone became wealthier. But with power came risk. The richer Venice became, the more its entire society depended on maintaining trade flows and the credibility of its financial system. If either failed, everything could collapse. By the 14th century, the Venetian model had spread. Florence and Genoa, and later the Dutch Republic, copied the system. Credit became the lifeblood of commerce. Wealth was no longer measured in gold or land, but in access to capital. Venice had inadvertently created the DNA of capitalism. Yet this new economy also created inequality. A handful of banking families began controlling most of the city's wealth. Their loans kept the government afloat, giving them immense political power. At its core, the Venetian Republic transformed into an oligarchy, a government of bankers, by bankers, for bankers. Meanwhile, Venice's rivals were catching up. Genoa financed Spanish conquests, and the Dutch built their own commercial empire. Venice's monopoly on wealth and innovation was fading. But its leaders did not see the danger. They believed their system was eternal. Then came the wars. In the 15th century, Venice found itself fighting the Ottoman Empire, France, and Spain, often all at once. Maintaining its fleet and defenses drained the treasury. To pay for it, the government issued more and more public debt. But this time, trade revenues were no longer rising to match. The balance had broken. By the early 16th century, the Venetian financial miracle began to look like a trap. The prestiti, once a symbol of power, became a burden. Interest payments consumed most of the government's income. Inflation rose. Confidence fell. The city that had invented the art of money was now choking on it. Venice's decline wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow suffocation. Its institutions, once models of financial genius, became rigid and self-serving. The very merchant class that built the system now refused to reform it. The government, dependent on their loans, was trapped. By the 16th century, the Venetian economy was hollowed out. Money still moved, but real wealth creation had stopped. The city was living off memories of its golden age. The key problem was the cycle of debt. The government borrowed heavily to fund wars, but victories were rare and costly. As military spending rose, so did taxes. Trade declined, and investors began to lose faith in the prestiti. The state had no choice but to force citizens to buy its bonds, turning voluntary lending into obligation. This was the moment Venice crossed the line. Debt was no longer a tool of prosperity, but a symptom of desperation. The story of Venice began to mirror that of later empires. When a government can no longer earn enough to pay its bills, it turns to financial manipulation. Venice devalued its currency multiple times to stretch its resources. Even the trusted ducat began losing value. Traders sought safer havens for their wealth, and new trade routes around Africa bypassed the Mediterranean entirely. The center of global trade shifted west to Portugal and Spain, and later to Holland. But Venice left behind something powerful, the idea of a central monetary authority. Its banking system showed that controlling credit meant controlling the economy. Centuries later, the Bank of England adopted the same principle. Venice proved that a government-backed financial institution could be the engine of both power and downfall. Inside Venice, social tensions were rising. The wealthy elite protected their privileges, while ordinary citizens suffered from inflation and unemployment. Markets that were once bustling emptied out. Foreign merchants abandoned the Rialto. The government, desperate for funds, began selling offices, titles, even judicial positions to the highest bidder. Corruption became systemic. Meanwhile, the city's once famous bureaucracy turned inward. Instead of promoting trade and innovation, it became obsessed with regulation, secrecy, and control. Business was strangled by paperwork. The entrepreneurial spirit that had made Venice rich died. The city became a museum of its past. Yet banking survived. The Casa di San Giorgio in Genoa, inspired by the Venetian model, continued to shape European finance. Even as Venice's trade declined, its credit techniques spread across Europe's rising financial centers. Amsterdam, London, Hamburg borrowed and improved upon Venetian ideas. By the 17th century, Venice's financial DNA could be found in every major European economy. Yet Venice's rulers did not see the full consequences. They had created the world's first financialized state, where the survival of the government depended on credit markets. When trade failed, they tried to cover the cracks with more borrowing. When confidence fell, they printed more money. It was a cycle that would repeat centuries later in the South Sea Bubble, the Great Depression, and the 2008 financial crisis. Venice was the first warning. By the 17th century, Venice had lost most of its territories. The great arsenal, once the most productive shipyard in Europe, had fallen silent. Trade had shifted to the Atlantic. Venice was no longer the banker of the world. It had become a debtor. The irony was complete. But the cruelest twist of history was yet to come. The very system Venice had pioneered, public debt, central banking, and credit-based finance, became the foundation of global capitalism. What destroyed Venice allowed modern economies to rise. For example, the ascent of London was built on the same financial principles that had once powered the Venetian Republic. The establishment of the Bank of England in 1694 almost exactly mirrored the structure of Venice's state bank. Investors lent money to the crown in exchange for interest-bearing bonds, just as Venetian citizens had done centuries earlier. Venice disappeared, but its ghost ruled from London. The Venetian model became the model of empire. Trade financed by debt, wars financed by bonds, prosperity bought on credit. The template of modern finance was complete. The story of Venice also reveals how fragile financial empires truly are. They do not collapse when they run out of gold. They collapse when they run out of trust. The Venetian government maintained the appearance of wealth long after it was bankrupt, because its citizens still believed the system worked. Once that belief vanished, the system imploded. Every major financial crisis since has followed the same pattern: faith first, collapse second. So, what can we learn from Venice? The city teaches us that money is not real wealth. Credit can multiply prosperity, but only for a time. When governments use debt to mask structural decline, collapse becomes inevitable. Venice's beauty remains, but its fortune is gone. Its system outlived it. It migrated to new empires, new currencies, new institutions. Venice's fall was not a historical accident. It was the logical outcome of a financial system built on confidence, leverage, and illusion. For centuries, the Republic mastered the art of turning promises into wealth. But once those promises exceeded real productivity, the illusion began to crack. Behind the marble facades and glittering canals, the Republic had become a paper empire. By the 18th century, the signs were unmistakable. Trade routes shifted. Atlantic powers, Britain, France, Spain, took control of global commerce. The Venetian fleet, once the envy of Europe, had become ceremonial. The city's bankers still handled local lending, but their influence was regional compared to the Amsterdam Exchange or London's rising financial markets. Venice had been the first to weaponize finance, but others had perfected it. The government responded in the only way it knew, by manipulating credit. New loans were issued to pay off old ones. Interest payments were rolled over. Accounting became increasingly creative. Officials boasted of Venice's eternal stability, but the balance sheets told another story. By the late 18th century, the Republic's debt was so enormous that even a modest rise in interest rates could bankrupt it overnight. And yet, the citizens still believed. They had been taught for generations that Venetian credit was sacred. They trusted the government more than gold. This psychological trick, convincing people that paper is as good as metal, may be Venice's greatest legacy. It predated every modern fiat system. The Venetian ducat was once gold. Now it was belief. This idea spread through Europe like wildfire. When the Bank of England began issuing banknotes, it borrowed more than just a financial mechanism. It adopted Venetian psychology. Money would be backed by confidence, not treasure. And confidence, as history shows, can be engineered. Venice did not just invent modern banking. It invented the illusion that sustains it. But there was one final act in Venice's story. When Napoleon invaded Italy in 1797, the Republic surrendered without a fight. The great city that had resisted empires and plagues fell within weeks. There was no money to raise an army, no credit left to borrow, no allies to call upon. The empire that built its power on money was destroyed by the absence of money. Napoleon did not conquer Venice with cannons, he conquered it with debt. When the French marched in, they seized the Venetian treasury. What they found shocked them. Ledgers filled with unpaid obligations, empty accounts, and evidence of decades of financial manipulation. Venice had not just been militarily defeated, it was already economically dead. The bankers who had once financed empires were now counting their losses. The Republic was dissolved. Its institutions were dismantled. Its archives were removed. But the story did not end there. The financial techniques Venice pioneered lived on in the capitals that replaced it. Amsterdam took the lead in the 17th century, refining bond markets and centralizing debt management. Then came London in the 18th century, transforming public credit into the backbone of empire. The world's most powerful nations built their dominance on Venetian principles: controlled credit, centralized finance, and the transformation of debt into wealth. But the story did not end there. The financial techniques Venice pioneered lived on in the capitals that replaced it. Amsterdam took the lead in the 17th century, refining bond markets and centralizing debt management. Then came London in the 18th century, transforming public credit into the backbone of empire. The world's most powerful nations built their dominance on Venetian principles: controlled credit, centralized finance, and the transformation of debt into wealth. And today, those same principles still govern our world. Every modern central bank, from the Federal Reserve to the European Central Bank, is an echo of Venice's Great Council and its financial offices. The tools have changed, but the structure is identical. Elites manage national debt behind closed doors. Citizens finance the state through inflation and taxation. And trust acts as the invisible foundation. The parallels are striking. Like Venice, modern economies rely on confidence rather than gold. Like Venice, they extend credit to its limits to maintain the illusion of prosperity. And like Venice, they believe their system is too sophisticated to fail. History suggests otherwise. No financial empire lasts forever. When you look at Venice's canals today, you see beauty, art, and decay. But beneath the surface lies a warning about money, power, and time. The city that once ruled the seas now sells souvenirs to tourists. Its glory survives only in memory and in the financial systems that inherited its methods. The Republic's genius became its downfall. It learned how to print wealth before it learned how to preserve it. The final lesson is simple. Every empire built on credit eventually faces its reckoning. Whether it is the Venetian Republic, the British Empire, or the United States, the pattern repeats. Debt grows faster than real wealth. Trust hides decay. And when trust finally breaks, collapse appears sudden, though it never truly is. Venice showed the world how to turn money into power, and how that power ultimately consumes itself.